Morning, everyone. I'm José Martínez. As Mate said, I'm a PhD student in political science. Before I begin, I just wanted to thank Naim Jenna and AMEC for inviting me. I grew up in a small island in the Caribbean called Puerto Rico, and South Africa. Its struggle for self-determination, its example of nonviolent resistance always stood out as an example for us, so to be here is quite a distinct honor and pleasure. So, today I'm going to talk about theories of sovereignty, and then I'm going to try to bring it back and talk about the Syrian civil war. I'm going to dwell quite a bit on theory here, because I think the concepts we use and the terms we employ to study places like Syria are important. So forgive me for this, but I'm going to take many of you back, I guess, to political science 101. So sovereignty. It's a term we throw around, we like to use it, and generally when political scientists talk about sovereignty, they refer back to Max Weber's kind of original definition, which is the institutional bureaucracy that claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. So this is the classic definition. It's the one we constantly use. It's the basis of much of international law. And I think there's a problem with this definition, and I think it hinders our analysis. And my first and primary critique of it is that it equates the state, sovereignty, and territory. Basically, it imagines all states uniformly exerting their control over what are kind of these static spaces of territory. So imagine when we talk about states, when we talk about international law, this is the conceptual apparatus that is implicitly operating almost always. But as most people here know, no such monopoly in Syria exists. I mean, this is an old map of the regions controlled and the areas controlled by different fighting forces. But where exactly is the institutional bureaucracy with the monopoly on legitimate use of force? I mean, clearly, there's more than one group competing for sovereignty. And here's another map, also a bit dated, but it shows the variety of people struggling over control. And how about the legitimate use of force? I mean, I think it'd be hard to claim that any one group in Syria has the monopoly on the legitimate use of force. So I think clearly what we need to do is to decouple sovereignty, the state, and territory. And I'm going to try to show why that is an important kind of theoretical move. So over the last 10 years, especially over the last 5, kind of a growing literature has emerged called the rebel governance literature. And what it tries to do is to say, okay, in war zones, clearly there is not just we don't just live in a Hobbesian world, right, where life is nasty, brutish, and short, where there's anarchy and chaos. There are other groups competing and offering public services, and the term that this literature and these scholars have come up with are rebel governance, and I've put up here some of the main sources if anyone would like to go and read some of this. And they push against, I guess, the classic assumptions of the literature that are, you know, there's one institutional bureaucracies that has the monopoly on legitimate force. And they study places like Colombia, all sorts of different countries in Africa where there are various people trying to claim sovereignty and legitimacy. And what they claim is that we have competing sovereigns. And I think this is quite a useful lens. It can help us study why different rebel groups and insurgencies provide public services, right? I think it can also help us look at things like judicial institutions, right? Why is it that rebel groups throughout the African continent, in the Middle East, have established these sorts of public services? But I still believe this approach, which is kind of the most innovative and cutting edge, has some very serious limitations. And I think, for one, it can only accommodate and do justice to well-established rebels and government forces. So this is kind of what I see as the classic paradigm of rebel governance, right? You have good guys, you have bad guys. They both don't look particularly nice, and they both are trying to secure a monopoly on legitimate use of force. But I think this approach has no analytical room for actors that play a key role in Syria. I mean, this is a very crude cartoon, but clearly it points to the fact that all sorts of international actors are rolling the dice, as one would say, right? And there are obviously other actors involved in the Syrian theater and in Iraq as well. But the rebel governance assumes these two sovereigns, right? We have one against the other, but it has no analytical space. How can we analyze what it is that these regional actors are doing? I also don't think it has space for humanitarian actors. I mean, 15 to 35% of Syrians now depend for their livelihood on the provision of foreign aid, international aid, generally provided by the UN World Food Program and its local the organizations it outsources its works to. So I think, yeah, the predominant approach cannot help explain what it is these actors are doing. So basically what we have is this in the classical vision, right? You have two, you have the rebels, you have the government, and the civilians are stuck in the middle, and there's no one else participating, right? But I think what it misses out on is, as Charles Tilley, this kind of eminent scholar that Ibrahim mentioned yesterday, is that most people, most of the time in war zones, are interacting in nonviolent ways. And I think Ayman Anmar's presentations help show there's a lot going on in these places. It's not just violence, war, and fighting. So I think when I was trying to make sense of what was going on in Syria, I found a few kind of post-structural approaches very useful. And I'm going to try to outline this now, but it is quite crude because of time, but I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. So I draw mainly on Foucault and Agamben. And Agamben is this very interesting Italian political theorist who traces his conception of sovereignty back to Roman law. And his contention is that sovereignty is not an institutional bureaucracy with the controls over the monopoly on legitimate force, but it's the monopoly to decide kind of who lives or dies, generally through the law, but not necessarily. And what I find Agamben useful for is kind of decoupling sovereignty from the state, right? So it's no longer state actors who are sovereign, or as the rebel governance literature would argue, it's not just rebels either, but it's more complex. And then what people who have studied Agamben and have used him have argued is that what we see when we apply his theoretical lens to places like Syria and Iraq is mobile sovereignties, graduated sovereignties, right? Where the monopoly to decide shifts, right? And I think this is very useful for studying the Islamic State because its territorial control is fluid, its boundaries are also fluid. Some places have been under its control for longer, but others are shifting, are not necessarily stable. So I think it shows us that sovereignty is constantly in production, right? We do not need to think of it as a static sort of order. And I think the empirical added value, which I'll go on to now, is that we can more fully grasp its iterations during the Syrian conflict. And I see state building, the provision of everyday, what we conceive of as state services, as an attempt to strive for sovereignty. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the Islamic State. And these are some, this is also a map from about a year ago. And most of the information I draw on comes from interviews, from information released by the Information Office of the Wilayat of Ra'a, where most people describe it as the eponymous capital of the Islamic State. So it's been kind of control of around 2 million residents. This obviously fluctuates in 21,000 square kilometers. And it's the place where ISIS has been control for the longest and the most consistent, and has been able to develop its kind of administrative apparatus in the most extensive ways. So what do we see ISIS do in the places it controls? And I mean, Ayman and Mara have gone into this at length, but I think I want to dwell on what has been published for internal consumption. So in their internal pamphlets, they talk about agriculture. There's a very elaborate plan for growing wheat. There's a public services department, the Diwan al-Khidamat, which does things like pick up trash, fill up potholes on the street, all the things you would expect of kind of your local municipal government. There's education, which Ayman also touched upon. There's public security. There's a court system. There's flour provision. And then my own interest is in their bread, in the provision of bread and what it means and what it demonstrates about the Islamic State. So I want to dwell on bread a bit here because subsidized bread is one of the most longest standing welfare programs in Syria. So beginning in 1970, when Bashar al-Assad's father took over the country, for the last 40 years, 45 years, Syrians have been receiving subsidized bread. It costs around 12 cents a kilo. It's been the same price for 20 years. And Hafiz al-Assad took counsel from the Soviets, actually, in the early 70s, who told him, you need to control wheat and bread. This is our experience. And he elaborated kind of a development plan in which, from the beginning of the supply chain until the end, wheat was completely controlled by the Syrian government. So farmers grew wheat with seeds given to them by the government. with fertilizer subsidized in turn by the government. They were only allowed to sell their wheat to the government's agricultural ministry, who then sent it to flour mills controlled by the government, who then distributed it to bakeries who had to give it at a certain price. So over 45 years, and I mean, the ubiquity of bakeries in Syria for anyone who was able to visit before the war was incredible, right? There was one in every corner. People depended on it for their kind of their subsistence, their everyday livelihoods. In certain areas of Syria before the war, 40% of caloric expenditures came from bread. So I guess it's no surprise that most groups in Syria, both rebel, Islamic State, and the YPG, once they take over a new section of the country, one of the first things they do is to take control of the bakery and the flour mill and to provide bread. I mean, it's a classic example of a state service, an example of exerting your sovereignty that Syrian citizens find to be very important. And there have been protests in all areas of Syria where bread has been of bad quality, or as bread has been of has not been available to all of its residents, right? And this shows also, I think, the agency that civilians have in war zone and how their demands can alter the patterns of governance in certain places. So what I have found, and many others, is that especially in its early iterations, kind of 2014, the first after 2015, ISIS kind of constantly found the need to perform the state, right, to strive for sovereignty. And it did this through kind of the micro practices of authority, which Ayman's documents, I mean, do an incredible task of kind of demonstrating, right? They want to strive to look like a state, to act like a state, and this involves symbolic acts of statehood, like setting up an education system, like how do you say it? Like collecting taxes, as Mara said, and then everyday techniques of governance, like providing bread. And what I think these do is more than just to kind of co-opt local residents, keep them quiet, but I think it also is crucial to giving a governing authority like the Islamic State its institutional appearance and its power. And ironically, over the last 6 or 7 months, because of a host of factors, but it has a lot to do with kind of the bombing efforts led by Russia and the coalition, one of the first things that ISIS has had to retract for lack of funds is its bread provision services. And you've seen increasing levels of protests in certain areas. So I think a crucial thing when we ponder the areas that ISIS has controlled, especially going forward, is to dissect these kind of everyday services, right? What are they doing? Are they successful? How is it that they go about performing like a state, trying to demonstrate their authority? And not just for ISIS, right, but for every other group performing in Syria. I think one of the key tasks of any kind of governing authority, whether it be at the local level, the regional, or the national, if we want to ponder what the options for the Iraqi government is going forward, is to act like a state, right, to perform services that are expected by its population. So I think the added value of this approach is to ponder, right, who is the sovereign? When we look at an area in Syria or Iraq, I think Minbij is a very interesting place to ponder because of kind of the coalition forces with I guess the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they're called, is probably going to take over the area in the next month. And it's an interesting case because in Manbij, before the Islamic State took over, one of the first things it did was to take over a flour mill just outside the town. And one of the biggest demands of the local coordination council, which are these like local bodies that offer administrative services in rebel-held areas, was to demand from foreign donors flour and bread, right? This is something we need to be able to feed the local population, maintain their allegiance. And the Islamic State very cleverly took over it, right? So now that they are very probably going to get kicked out, I think it'll be interesting to see if the Syrian Democratic Forces, if the civilian kind of administrative structure does things like provide bread. So I think wondering whose violence is legitimate and who is sovereign in these sort of situations, it's a difficult question, right? I mean, this is a parody here, but as we all know, I mean, the Russians have been very involved, let's say, in the Syrian theater. And is their violence legitimate? Is it not? So under the classical definition, it's difficult to answer who would be the sovereign in Syria, right? Because you have all sorts of actors participating. Who has the monopoly to decide? This is a local diwan deciding, I think it is it's a tribal council who's trying to decide I believe this is the case of one tribe which was loyal to the Assad regime and what to do with them. And so they clearly have some decision-making power. And then the other question is, who has the monopoly to decide who lives or dies? When so many Syrians are dependent on foreign aid, clearly the World Food Program wields incredible sovereign power, right? When you feed 15 to 35% of the population, you wield a certain sort of authority. So I think these actors need to be integrated into our way of thinking about sovereignty and state-making. And I want to dwell on this last picture a bit just to kind of demonstrate the importance of what I was saying. This is a World Food Program package, and you can see it just sticking out on the left, the slogan of the World Food Program. And ISIS, the Islamic State, took these food packages that were supposed to be sent, I think it's to Idlib. They took them and then they recovered them with their own propaganda, announcing that they were the ones distributing bread and it wasn't the UN. So the fact that they took, and I believe there are 7,000 packages in this delivery, the fact that they took so much effort to put their own sort of propaganda on top of the UN's, I think demonstrates the importance of being seen to be acting like a state during a civil war. So what I found and what I think is important to think about is that sovereignty in these places is not uniform, it's not easy to define, but it's shared or contested by an array of organizations. And the post-structural kind of approaches that I've mentioned can integrate all these actors in ways that I think kind of the classical definition simply cannot. And I think what we see in Syria is a field of contingent or mobile sovereignties, right? And what is necessary to ponder going forward is that populations throughout the country have been subject to different forms of rule and citizenship, right? So what does that mean for national reconciliation? What does that mean for state building in the future when everyone has had various experiences of local governance for the last 4 or 5 years? And the longer it lasts, the more varying these experiences will come, right? So I think when sovereignty is tentative, when it's hard to define, emergent and constantly shifting, I think a useful lens is to look at the mundane, right? To return to that which we tend to underestimate, but when you don't have running water or electricity or food to feed your family, the mundane becomes very important. So I think we should ponder these kind of symbolic acts of statehood, these everyday techniques of governance, and of course, this is an exaggeration because it's my own field of study and specialty, but in some ways it is all about bread.